Hello, my name is Randy Hillier. For 15 years, I was an elected representative in the Ontario legislature. Join me at Scuttlebutt Lodge, my camp here in Lanark County, as I'm joined by great Canadians who are making a positive contribution to advocate for and defend faith, freedom, and democracy. Come on in.
Well, it's been a busy week for corruption and the theatrics in politics in Canada and indeed the Western world. But we could be speaking about the bank runs, we could be speaking about the new formalized alliance between two nuclear superpowers this week in Moscow as Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin got together to oppose the American hegemony and the war in Ukraine. But let's speak about something a little bit closer to home and look at the theater and the corruption and how it's disguised. This week, we've been hearing, or for the past couple weeks, we've been hearing about China interference. That in itself is a deception. There is no China interference in our politics. We have collusion happening. Interference is when someone or something is unwelcomed and not wanted. What we're seeing with China and our elected representatives here is that they are welcomed. And I'm going to speak a little bit and show some evidence because we've known about the collusion between Chinese interests, as well as other corporate interests from around the world with our political parties. But this week we had, of course, the Liberal Member of Parliament, Han Dong, leave the Liberal caucus as a result of the leaks from CSIS, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. He had to step down from caucus. But let's not forget, just 2 weeks ago in the Ontario legislature, another elected member also resigned. But this one was Vincent Key, and he resigned from the Conservative caucus in Ontario. What we do know for certain, without question, is that when it comes to Chinese collusion and corporate collusion with our political parties, it is a bipartisan issue. All political parties benefit immensely from their collusion with corporate interests, whether they be homegrown or from China or anywhere else. And we've known this with China specifically since 1997. That is when the two security services in Canada, CSIS and the RCMP, released a draft report. And I'm going to put it up on screen for you shortly to see. But in 1997, as a result of whistleblowers talking about the corruption in the Canadian embassy in Hong Kong, our security services went to work and started researching how much collusion was happening between Chinese organized crime, Canadian businesses, and the Canadian political system. So let's pull it up on screen. Here it is. Title is Sidewinder, Secret RCMP CSIS Joint Review, Draft Submission. Now what's important, this never went to the final stage. The report was killed by the Liberal government of the day, and it was never permitted to become a formal document or on the public record. But there it is. Title is Sidewinder, Chinese Intelligence Services and Triad's Financial Links to Canada, submitted in 1997. 25 years ago, we knew that something was wrong. Let's scroll down a little bit, and here we go in the forward. This document does not present theories, but indicators of a multifaceted threat to Canada's national security based on concrete facts drawn from the database of the two agencies. So it's quite a story. I'm not going to get into every little detail on this report, but I wanted to highlight a few key elements, a few key paragraphs. And here we go in the introduction. And this is, again, 25 years ago. Over 200 Canadian companies were now under the influence and ownership of criminal organizations from China, as well as communist state-owned operatives. And these were some pretty big companies at the time, and still are. Norinco, Husky Oil, the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce, the Ramada Hotels, and others like Merrill Lynch and Gordon Capital. And why I point this out, it is Chinese collusion with corporate Canada and our political parties is expansive. It is involved in our universities, our banking system, our high-tech companies, our oil and gas. Every facet of the Canadian economy is highly influenced by criminal organizations and or Chinese state-owned operatives. And they use the wealth and the prestige of these business organizations to curry favor and influence every political party. And here's another little section, just again from 25 years ago, that one Chinese operative at the time owned between 1/6 and 1/3 of all of downtown Vancouver. And if you're in the political office, people with money, big players, they get a seat at the table. They can buy their way into the table of influence. Let's go down. One more. And again, this is from 25 years ago. China remains one of the greatest ongoing threats to Canadian national security and the Canadian industry. Now, our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, says that he wasn't really certain and sure of Chinese interference. And I'm sure he is being somewhat truthful in that because they're not interfering. When they gave his foundation $1 million, that was not unwelcomed. That was mutually beneficial, buying influence in our political system. And if we scroll down a little bit more, we can see just some additional extent of their involvement. And this is an interesting one. In this, it's about the multinationals that are influenced or under control and ownership of triads and communist Chinese state actors. In this bottom paragraph, in Canada, it is estimated that CITIC has invested nearly $500 million to buy up businesses such as pulp mills in British Columbia, Nova Corp, a petrochemical firm in Alberta, real estate, and hotels. But this is a key one because I'll be coming up with this after. Eventually, they developed a close business link with Power Corporation of Canada. Why is that important? Well, in Canada, we have a company, a group of people called the Canada Chinese Business Council. And I'm going to move over and show you another slide of the Canada Chinese Business Council and just who's involved with it. And ostensibly, their purpose, their objective is to facilitate trade and commerce and investment with China, Chinese companies, Chinese investors, and Canadian businesses, Canadian investors. And they've done an admirable job. And I want to take attention to who is on the board of directors, but I'll give you a little history about them first. This was started back in the 90s as well, under Paul Desmarais, the owner of Power Corporation. And as we just saw in that Project Sidewinder report, the Chinese individuals who CSIS and RCMP were detailing also made reference to the close relationship with Power Corporation of Canada. Paul Desmarais then goes on to create the Canada-China Business Council. He has passed away. But let's look at who's on the board of directors today. Well, the first one is Olivier Desmarais, who I believe is the grandson of Paul Desmarais. But right on this same line, the vice chair is the Honorable Scott Bryson. Now, people may remember him. He was a Conservative member of Parliament from Nova Scotia, and he also ran for the leadership of the Conservative Party of Canada, but he was defeated by Peter MacKay, I believe, at the time. Shortly afterwards, when Harper became leader, Scott Bryson crossed the floor and sat as a Liberal and became a minister, a Liberal cabinet minister. So we can see that Scott Bryson, when it comes to political ideology or partisanship, he swings both ways. He swings all ways, Liberal, Conservative, and whatever else, as long as. But now he is in a senior position with the Canada-China Business Council, along with his extensive network of political operatives over his years. On the next line, another vice chair is the Honorable Martin Cauchon. He's now with a legal firm, but at one time he was a cabinet minister in the Liberal government. And as we scroll through this list of directors, you'll be quite amazed and surprised of just the convergence between political operatives, corporate operatives, and the Canada-China Business Council. Here we have our well-known friend Sam, who rose to prominence during the SNC-Lavalin scandal with the Liberal government. You may recall Jody Wilson-Raybould was the Minister of Justice in the Trudeau Liberal government, and she wanted to permit the Justice Department to prosecute SNC-Lavalin. They had also been caught giving the Liberals $100,000 unlawfully as well, but for their many nefarious commercial interactions, they had run afoul of the law. But in the end, Canada did not prosecute SNC-Lavalin, and Jody Wilson-Raybould got the hook. She didn't read her script very well and didn't follow the script very well, so out on her backside she went. Then we also have, of course, Gwen Burroughs, who is with the University of Toronto, Laura Hewitt with Sun Life Canada, and we'll go down a few more. Here we have Joyce Lee, who is a partner with the large and prestigious legal firm McCarthy Tétrault, and we have many. Brookfield Asset Management. Now, a lot of people might not recall, but Brookfield Asset Management has a significant, or did have a significant contractual arrangement managing all the properties owned by the Government of Canada in the National Capital area. And here's a real interesting one. The Honorable James Moore, just to show that this is not a partisan relationship. The Honorable James Moore, former cabinet minister in the Stephen Harper government, who now works for another large, prestigious law firm, Denton's. He is intimately involved with the Canada-China Business Council. And it just wouldn't be right not to have Bombardier. Here we have Pierre Puan, Vice President of Bombardier. And we all know that Bombardier has been very prolific at receiving substantial amounts of monies from both liberal and conservative governments over the years. Well, they have a hand here as well, ensuring that Chinese interests, Canadian interests, Canadian corporate interests control and are influential and ensure that political parties serve their interests. But we have, continue on, the Royal Bank of Canada, Air Canada, the Bank of Montreal, capital markets. This is a who's who of political and corporate players who wield and collude to ensure that their interests are taken care of in Canada's political system. So there's a little bit of a sketch. Is it really interference if people are welcomed into your table and people like SNC are benefiting and Bombardier are benefiting? I don't call that interference. This is collusion, and it demonstrates that all our established political parties are using words and language to disguise their involvement with not just their involvement, using words and language to disguise from the Canadian public just whose interest these political parties serve. And I think I'll end this off with a short little story about more political theater, one that I witnessed directly. Well, maybe before I get there. In my time in Ontario politics, there was 3 countries that were prolific in enticing and providing goodwill friendship trips, all expenses paid junkets. One was China, another one was Taiwan, and the third was Israel. These were the 3 countries that spent significant amounts of money to fly Canadian politicians on all expense paid trips, lavish trips, to their countries to build relationships with. Now, I never went on any of these junkets, but I know many who did. We knew, anybody who was half awake knew what these countries were doing. They were finding who were the weak links, who were the people that they could purchase, and then use that purchasing power to have them protect their interests and expand their influence and their money. So Israel, China, Taiwan, they're the ones that I saw that were the most aggressive in purchasing Canadian politicians. And the Canadian politicians loved it. There weren't many that would not jump at the chance to go on an all expenses paid holiday and establish goodwill with other countries. But I want to end off with one little story from my time in elected office about the theater, because again, it's not just liberals and conservatives who are engaged in the theater. For many years in the Ontario legislature, Jagmeet Singh was a member of the Ontario NDP before he became the leader of the federal NDP. And I used to always see Jagmeet cycling around Queen's Park, and he had this old-fashioned bicycle, not a 10-speed or multi-speed bicycle, but just an old-fashioned standard bicycle that he would ride around Queen's Park on. And of course he had his man purse swung over his shoulder as he did it. And he was showing everybody just how environmentally conscientious he was. And it puzzled me a little bit because Jagmeet lived about 60 miles away and represented the riding, one of the ridings in Brampton, about 60 miles from Queen's Park. And I was certain that there was no way that he was riding his bicycle every day down to Queen's Park. So one day, I left the legislature and I was walking back to my apartment in Little Portugal in Toronto. And about a mile away from Queen's Park, there I see Jagmeet Singh getting off his bicycle, and he has a BMW sitting there, a BMW with a bicycle carrier on the trunk. And he starts to put his bicycle on the carrier on his BMW. So here it is. It was for show. He parked a little bit away from Queen's Park where he thought people weren't going to see him, weren't going to see that he actually drove a very nice and expensive BMW back and forth from Brampton and not his bicycle. Disguised what he was doing. And why would you, in practical terms, why would you drive 59 miles in your BMW, then park it a mile away from Queen's Park, and then get on your bicycle, other than for optics and show? There's a whole host of observations and experiences and witnessing firsthand the theater and the corruption in Canadian politics. I hope you enjoyed today's Scuttlebutt Lodge and another episode of theater and corruption in Canadian politics. If you like the show, make sure you hit the notifications. Every week we'll be bringing you more stories of the corruption in party politics. Like, follow, share, and if you'd like to come down to the lodge, make sure to go on nomorolockdowns.ca and book a little time to get away from the theater and the corruption and have a little honest time and friendly time at Scuttlebutt Lodge.